Morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape when Morales first spotted the Apache camp nestled between red rock formations. He had been traveling alone for 3 days, his horse weary and his water supply running dangerously low. The Mexican trader knew he was taking an enormous risk approaching the Apache settlement, but desperation often makes men brave when wisdom would counsel retreat. Not like other traders who ventured into Apache territory with armed escorts and wagon trains full of goods. He was a solitary man who believed in the power of respect and fair dealing. His weathered face bore the marks of years spent under the desert sun, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had learned to read the intentions of both friend and foe. He carried only what his horse could bear, carefully selected items that he knew would be valued by the Apache people. He approached the camp, could see the familiar sight of hide lodges arranged in a loose circle, with cooking fires sending thin wisps of smoke into the clear morning air. Children played between the structures while women worked on various tasks, their movements efficient and purposeful. The men of the tribe watched his approach with the careful attention that had kept their people alive in this harsh land for generations. Apache who came forward to meet him was a man of middle years with intelligent dark eyes and a bearing that spoke of authority. This was, whose name meant, he works hard in the Apache language, had dealt with Mexican traders before, and he knew that this lone man approaching their camp was either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps, he thought as he studied his respectful demeanor, he might be both. On it slowly, keeping his hands visible and moving with deliberate care. He had learned enough Apache words over the years to offer a proper greeting, and he could see approval in his eyes as he spoke. The two men sized each other up in the way that men do when much depends on first impressions and mutual understanding. He opened his pack with ceremonial care, revealing the items he had brought for trade. There were metal tools that would be useful for hunting and daily tasks, colorful cloth that would please the women, and various small items that he had learned the Apache valued. But among these practical goods, carried something that no Apache had ever seen before, a small hand mirror with a polished silver surface that reflected images with startling clarity. And each item with the eye of an experienced trader, but when unwrapped the mirror, something changed in the air around them. The Apache leader had seen his reflection in still water before, but never with such perfect clarity. The mirror seemed to capture not just his image, but something deeper, as if it held a piece of his spirit within its silver surface. The strange object spread quickly through the camp, and soon people began to gather around the two men. Among them was a young woman named, whose name meant Eternal Blossom. She was perhaps 16 years old, with the quick intelligence and natural grace that marked her as someone special within her tribe. Had always been curious about the world beyond their camp, and the presence of the Mexican trader stirred that curiosity in new heights. Continued to study the mirror, turning it this way and that to catch the light, found herself drawn closer. She had never seen anything like it, and when she caught a glimpse of her own face reflected in its surface, she gasped audibly. The reaction was so genuine and filled with wonder that both men turned to look at her. On its expression something that reminded him of his own daughter, who lived far away in a small village near Mexico City. The same wonder, the same bright intelligence, the same hunger to understand the world around her. Without thinking, he held the mirror toward her, allowing her to see her reflection more clearly. What happened next would be remembered in the camp for generations to come. Took the mirror in her hands with the reverence one might show to a sacred object. As she looked at her own face reflected back at her with perfect clarity, tears began to flow down her cheeks. But these were not tears of sadness, they were tears of recognition and wonder. The first time in her life could see herself as others saw her. The mirror showed her the strong line of her jaw, the way her dark eyes held flecks of amber when the light struck them just right, and the graceful arch of her eyebrows that gave her face its distinct character. She could see the small scar on her chin from a childhood fall, and the way her hair caught the sunlight and held it like captured fire. The members of the tribe watched in fascination as explored this new way of seeing herself. Some of the older women muttered prayers under their breath, uncertain whether this object that captured reflections might also capture souls. But the younger people pressed closer, eager for their own chance to look into the magical surface. He found himself in an unusual position. As a leader, he was responsible for protecting his people from dangerous magic, but he could see no malice in either the trader or his strange gift. The mirror seemed to bring joy rather than harm, and the genuine delight on his face was something that warmed his heart despite his caution. The trading session that followed was unlike any he had ever experienced. The Apache offered him valuable items, beautifully worked leather goods, silver jewelry of their own making, and even some of their prized horses. But all attention kept returning to the mirror and the reactions of those who saw themselves in it for the first time. An older woman named finally worked up the courage to look into the mirror. She began to laugh with pure joy. She had not seen her own face clearly in many years, and the mirror revealed that time had been kinder to her than she had imagined. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter rather than hardship, and her smile transformed her features in a way that surprised even her own family. The day progressed, it became clear that something significant was happening in the camp. The mirror was passing from hand to hand, and with each person who looked into it, there seemed to be a moment of profound recognition. Children squealed with delight at seeing their own faces, young warriors admired their strong features, and elders gazed with satisfaction at the wisdom written in their lined faces. It was who remained most affected by the experience. She had always known herself through the reactions of others, the approval in her mother's eyes when she completed a task well, the admiration of young men who watched her walk through camp, the respect of elders who valued her quick mind. The mirror, however, showed her something different. It showed her herself as she truly was, independent of others' opinions and expectations. Being approached, found himself in an unexpected position. He had come to trade and leave, but the Apache people seemed reluctant to let him go. Invited him to share their evening meal, and as they sat around the fire, the conversation turned to the strange magic of the mirror. A mixture of Spanish, Apache words, and gestures, the people of the camp shared their reaction to seeing themselves so clearly. Some spoke of recognizing family resemblances they had never noticed before. Others talked about seeing strength or beauty in their own features that they had not known was there. But all agreed that the experience had been profound and meaningful. Quietly through much of the conversation, but could see that she was processing the day's events deeply. When she finally spoke, it was to ask him about the world beyond the desert, about the places where such mirrors were common, and what other wonders might exist in those distant lands. Questions revealed a mind hungry for knowledge and experience, and found himself describing cities and technologies that must have seemed like fantasies to someone who had lived her entire life in the traditional Apache way. He told her about great buildings that reached toward the sky, about ships that could cross vast oceans, and about books that held the accumulated knowledge of generations. The fire burned lower, and the night sounds of the desert began to replace the conversations of the day, made a decision that would change everything. He could see that the mirror meant more to these people than any amount of practical goods ever could. More than that, he could see that the encounter with her own reflection had awakened something in her, a sense of possibility and wonder that deserved to be nurtured. Asked about trading for the mirror, surprised everyone by refusing payment. Instead, he offered it as a gift, saying that some things were too valuable to be bought or sold. The gesture created a bond of respect and friendship that transcended the usual boundaries between Mexican traders and Apache tribes. As prepared to leave the next morning, he could not have imagined the consequences his gift would set in motion. The mirror had done more than show the Apache people their own faces. It had opened a window to a wider world and planted seeds of curiosity that would soon grow into something much larger. Watching as the trader mounted his horse and prepared to continue his journey. In her hands, she still held the mirror, and in her heart, she carried new questions about herself and her place in the world. The reflection she had seen was just the beginning of a journey of discovery that would ultimately challenge everything her people thought they knew about the world beyond their desert home. Rode away into the morning heat shimmer, neither he nor the Apache people could foresee the chain of events that had been set in motion by a simple act of generosity. The mirror would become much more than a curiosity or a treasure. It would become a catalyst for change that would ripple through the tribe in ways both wonderful and dangerous. The days following his departure, the mirror became the most precious possession in his camp. It was kept in his lodge, wrapped carefully in soft deerskin, and brought out only for special occasions. But the impact of that first encounter with their own reflections continued to work its way through the tribe like water seeping through desert rock. Herself changed in ways she could not fully understand. The image she had seen in the mirror stayed with her, not just the physical features, but something deeper. For the first time, she had seen herself as a complete person, separate from her roles as daughter, paternal wife, and member of the tribe. The reflection had shown her someone who existed in her own right, with her own thoughts and dreams and possibilities. New awareness made her restless in ways that worried her family. She began to question customs that she had always accepted without thought. Why should women not be allowed to participate in certain ceremonies? Why were there places in the camp where only men could go? Why should her future be determined by arrangements between families rather than by her own choices? Mother watched these changes with growing concern, had raised her daughter to be respectful and obedient, preparing her for a traditional role as wife and mother, but now seemed to be pulling away from these expectations, asking questions that had no comfortable answers and expressing ideas that challenged the established order of their world. Tension came to a head one evening when announced that she wanted to learn to use a bow and arrow for hunting, not just for protection. This was traditionally a male skill, and her request caused an uproar in the lodge. Her father, a respected warrior named, was torn between his love for his daughter and his duty to uphold tribal traditions. Was not the only one affected by the mirror's revelations. Other young people in the tribe had also begun to question long-held assumptions about their lives and futures. The mirror had shown them not just their faces, but possibilities they had never considered before. If they could see themselves so clearly in the polished surface, what else might they be able to see and understand about their world? Shift in perspective did not go unnoticed by the tribal elders. The older woman who had laughed with joy at her reflection found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending the mirror against criticism from her peers. Some of the elders believed that the Mexican trader's gift had brought dangerous influences into their peaceful camp. The matter was complicated by the arrival of a group of Apache warriors from another band. They had heard rumors about the strange object that captured reflections, and they came ostensibly to trade, but really to investigate what they saw as potential threat to traditional ways. Among them was a man named, whose reputation as both a fierce warrior and a conservative keeper of old traditions preceded him. Imposing figure, tall and muscular, with scars that told the story of many battles and eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it harshly. He had fought against Mexican incursions into Apache territory for years, and he viewed any influence from the outside world with deep suspicion. The idea that his people might be accepting gifts from Mexican traders struck him as a dangerous precedent. Showed the mirror, the visiting warrior's reaction was immediate and negative. He refused to look into it himself, declaring that it was a tool of evil magic designed to steal Apache souls. His words carried weight with some members of the tribe who had harbored their own doubts about the mysterious object. Vision within the camp became more pronounced as days passed. Those who had experienced the wonder of seeing their own reflections defended the mirror passionately, while those who feared its influence argued for its destruction. Found herself at the center of the conflict, as her changed behavior was seen as evidence of the mirror's corrupting power. The situation reached a crisis point when publicly announced that she intended to leave the camp to explore the wider world. She had been thinking about descriptions of distant cities and different ways of life, and the mirror had given her the confidence to believe that she could succeed in such places. The reaction to her announcement was explosive. As if he had been struck by lightning. The idea of his daughter leaving the safety and protection of the tribe was unthinkable. Where would she go? How would she survive? What kind of life could a young Apache woman hope to have in the Mexican world that lay beyond the desert? His anger and fear made him receptive to his arguments about the mirror's evil influence. Devastated, she blamed herself for not seeing the signs earlier and not taking action to counter the mirror's effects on her daughter. In her mind, the strange object had stolen her child's contentment and replaced it with impossible dreams that could only lead to heartbreak and disaster. Was not alone in her thinking. Several other young people in the tribe had been inspired by her courage to speak openly about their own desire for different lives. A young man named admitted that he wanted to learn to read and write, skills that were possessed by some Mexican traders, but unknown among the Apache. A girl named said she dreamed of seeing the great water that had described, the ocean that stretched beyond the horizon. The revelations created a generational divide in the camp that went beyond the specific question of the mirror. The older generation saw their carefully preserved traditions and values being challenged by ideas that threatened the very foundation of Apache life. The younger generation saw possibilities for growth and change that excited them even as they frightened their elders. He seized upon this division as evidence that the mirror was indeed dangerous. He argued that the Apache way of life had sustained their people for countless generations, keeping them strong and free in a hostile world. Any influence that encouraged young people to abandon these proven ways was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Debate raged through the camp for days. Families were split as parents tried to understand children who seemed to have become strangers overnight. Friends found themselves on opposite sides of arguments about tradition versus change, safety versus adventure, and the value of outside influences versus the wisdom of ancestral ways. Put himself in an impossible position as leader. He could see merit in both sides of the argument. The mirror had brought wonder and joy to many of his people, but it had also created conflict and uncertainty. His own reaction to seeing his reflection had been positive, but he could not ignore the concerns of respected elders who feared for the future of their traditions. Tension in the camp affected every aspect of daily life. Work that had once been done cooperatively became a source of friction as people sorted themselves into opposing camps. Children watched their parents argue about things they did not fully understand, and the usual harmony of troubled life was replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety and discord. All of this unfolded with a mixture of guilt and determination. She had not intended to cause such upheaval in her community, but she could not bring herself to renounce the new understanding of herself that the mirror had provided. The reflection she had seen was not just an image. It was a recognition of her own agency and potential that she could not unsee. The conflict intensified. It became clear that something would have to give. The camp could not continue indefinitely in a state of division and tension. Either the mirror would have to be destroyed to restore harmony, or those who opposed it would have to accept its permanent presence in their lives. The solution, when it came, would be more dramatic than anyone anticipated. But before that climax arrived, the seeds of change that had been planted by a simple reflection in polished silver would continue to grow, sending roots deep into the bedrock of Apache tradition, and preparing the ground for transformations that would reshape their world forever. Mirror had become more than an object. It was now a symbol of the eternal tension between preservation and progress, between the safety of the known and the excitement of the unknown. And at the heart of that symbol stood a young woman whose glimpse of her own reflection had started a revolution she could neither stop nor fully control. The confrontation that would determine the mirror's fate began on a morning when the desert air shimmered with unusual tension. Had spent the night rallying support among those who viewed the mirror as a dangerous influence, while and her allies had gathered to defend not just the object itself, but what it represented, the right to see themselves and their possibilities clearly. The entire tribe assembled in the center of the camp, forming a large circle around the area where such important matters were traditionally debated. Stood in the middle, holding the wrap mirror, knowing that his decision would affect the unity and future of his people. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier on his shoulders. First, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. He talked about the generations of Apache ancestors who had lived and died according to the traditional ways, never needing magic objects from the outside world to know their place and purpose. He pointed to the discord that had entered their peaceful camp since the mirror's arrival, and he warned of greater disruption to come if such influences were allowed to continue. Words resonated with many of the older tribe members, who nodded their agreement and voiced their support. They spoke of the importance of maintaining Apache identity in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their way of life. The mirror, they argued, was just the beginning. If young people were allowed to pursue dreams inspired by foreign influences, it would not be long before the tribe lost its cohesion entirely. When rose to respond, something remarkable happened. The young woman who had once been known for her quiet obedience had been transformed by her encounter with her own reflection into someone who could speak with passion and conviction about things that mattered to her. Her voice, though still respectful, carried a new strength that commanded attention. Did not argue against the value of Apache traditions or the wisdom of their ancestors. Instead, she spoke about the difference between preserving what was valuable and rejecting everything that was new. The mirror, she said, had not changed who she was. It had helped her see who she had always been. It had shown her strengths and capabilities that had been there all along, but had never been acknowledged or developed. Words sparked responses from other young people in the tribe who had been inspired by her courage. Spoke about his desire to learn reading and writing, not to abandon Apache ways, but to better protect his people's interests in dealings with the outside world. Talked about her curiosity about distant places not as a rejection of her homeland, but as a natural expression of the Apache spirit of exploration that had always characterized them. The debate continued. It became clear that the real issue was not the mirror itself, but what it symbolized, the question of how the Apache people should respond to a changing world. The older generation's fears were based on real concerns about the survival of their culture, while the younger generation's desires were driven by genuine aspirations for growth and understanding. The elder woman who had been among the first to look in the mirror prized everyone by rising to speak in its defense. She reminded the assembled tribe that the Apache had always been a people who adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential identity. The ability to see clearly, whether the terrain ahead, the intentions of enemies, or the truth about themselves, had always been a source of Apache strength. Intervention shifted the tenor of the discussion. Here was someone whose wisdom and experience could not be questioned, arguing that the mirror represented not a departure from Apache values, but an expression of them. The ability to see truly and clearly, she suggested, was something their ancestors would have valued and used wisely. This position becoming more difficult to defend as the debate evolved. He had expected to face the naive enthusiasm of young people, but instead he was confronting a more sophisticated argument about the nature of tradition and change. When even respected elders began to question his position, he realized that his campaign against the mirror was failing. Desperation made a fateful decision. If words could not convince the tribe to reject the dangerous influence of the mirror, then perhaps action would. While the debate continued, he moved quietly toward and suddenly grabbed the wrap mirror from the leader's hands. Before anyone could react, he threw it with all his strength against a nearby rock formation. A sound of shattering glass cut through the morning air like a knife. For a moment, the entire assembly stood in stunned silence as fragments of silver glass caught the sunlight and scattered across the desert floor. The mirror that had brought such wonder and controversy to their camp was destroyed, reduced to glittering shards that would never again show anyone their reflection. Silence that followed was broken by his voice, raised not in anger, but in something that sounded remarkably like laughter. As the tribe watched in amazement, she walked to where the large piece of the mirror had fallen and picked it up. Even broken, the fragment still held enough of its reflective surface to show her face, though now it was fractured into multiple images that shifted and changed as she moved it in the light. Yet her fragmented reflection spoke words that would be remembered long after the last shard of glass had been ground into desert sand by wind and time. She said that it had made an error in thinking that destroying the mirror would destroy what it had shown them. The reflections they had seen were not trapped in the glass. They lived in their hearts and minds now, and no amount of force could take them away. Words triggered a transformation in the crowd that no one had anticipated. Instead of mourning the loss of the mirror, people began to speak about what they had learned from their brief encounter with their own reflections. They talked about seeing strength in their faces, beauty in their features, and potential in their eyes that they carried within themselves regardless of whether any mirror existed to show it to them. processing the sudden destruction of the precious object he had been charged with protecting, found himself facing a situation that required wisdom beyond his experience. The mirror was gone, but the changes it had catalyzed in his people were clearly permanent. The question now was how to lead a tribe that had been fundamentally altered by a brief encounter with a simple piece of polished glass. In the end, it was himself who provided the solution, though not in the way anyone expected. Confronted with the realization that his dramatic gesture had failed to achieve its intended purpose, he began to understand something about the true nature of change and tradition. The young people of the tribe had not been corrupted by foreign influence. They had been awakened to possibilities that had always existed within them. The conversation that followed the mirror's destruction was different from the debate that had preceded. Instead of arguing about whether change was good or bad, the tribe began to discuss how to manage change in ways that preserved what was valuable while embracing what was beneficial. They talked about sending some of their young people to learn about the outside world while ensuring they remained connected to their Apache roots. The proposal to leave the camp was reconsidered not as an abandonment of her people, but as a form of exploration that could benefit the entire tribe. If she learned about distant places and different ways of life, she could return with knowledge that would help her people navigate an increasingly complex world. Other young people with similar aspirations were given similar consideration. The solution that emerged from that day was more nuanced and sophisticated than the simple choice between keeping or destroying the mirror. The tribe decided to establish what they called pathways, structured opportunities for young people to explore the wider world while maintaining their connections to Apache culture and values. Would travel with traders to learn about commerce and negotiation. Others would spend time in Mexican settlements to master reading and writing. Still others would journey to distant Apache bands to learn different approaches to traditional skills and knowledge. But all would return regularly to share what they had learned and to renew their connections to their home community. Pulled by the unexpected outcome of his actions, became one of the strongest supporters of this new approach. He realized that his fear of change had been based on a false assumption that preserving Apache culture required rejecting all outside influences. The mirror's destruction had taught him that the strength of their traditions lay not in their isolation, but in their ability to help Apache people thrive in any circumstances. The sun set on that transformative day. The fragments of the broken mirror were not swept away or buried, but were carefully collected by various members of the tribe. Each person took a small piece as a reminder not of the mirror itself, but of what they had learned about themselves when they first looked into its surface. Later, when traders and travelers told stories about the Apache band that had achieved an unusual balance between tradition and innovation, they often mentioned the legend of the magical mirror that had changed everything. But those who had actually lived through those events knew that the real magic had not been in the glass at all. It had been in the courage to see themselves clearly and the wisdom to embrace both change and continuity. Eventually leave the camp to explore the wider world, but she returned regularly with knowledge and experiences that enriched her people's understanding of their changing environment. The mirror that had shown her her own reflection was gone, but the vision of herself as someone capable of great things remained as clear as ever. Apache people had learned that true strength came not from fearing change, but from facing it with open eyes and steady hearts. The mirror had been destroyed, but the reflection of their potential continued to shine in everything they chose to do. And in the end, that reflection proved to be far more durable and valuable than any piece of polished glass could ever be. The story of the mirror became a teaching tale that parents shared with their children, reminding each new generation that the power to see clearly, whether looking at themselves or at the world around them, was one of the greatest gifts they could possess. And somewhere in the desert, scattered grains of sand still caught the light and sparkled with the memory of a time when one small act of generosity changed the way an entire people saw themselves and their place in an ever-changing world.